A Marine comes home early, excited to surprise his wife after months apart. But what he finds shatters him. A moment that looks like the ultimate betrayal. His wife and his own brother, together in an intimate embrace. Furious and heartbroken, he demands answers. But when she hands him a stack of letters he's never seen before, her explanation leaves him speechless and in tears. What secrets are hidden in those letters? And how could they change everything he thought he knew about his family? This is a story of love, sacrifice, and forgiveness that you won't want to miss. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal cast harsh shadows as James Jimmy Carter adjusted his Marine dress uniform. His polished black shoes clicked against the tile floor as he made his way through the crowded space, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. After 18 months away, everything felt both familiar and strange. His heart raced with anticipation. 2 weeks early, Lily would never expect it. He could already picture her face lighting up, those green eyes widening in surprise. The thought brought a rare smile to his usually stern features. "Welcome home, sir," the cab driver said as James slid into the back seat outside the airport. "Where to?" James gave his address, then settled back against the worn leather seat. Streetlights flickered past as they drove through the quiet suburbs. Each landmark stirred memories. The park where he and Lily used to walk their dog, the diner where they had their first date, the elementary school where they'd hoped their future children would attend. The cab turned onto Maple Street, and James's pulse quickened. Their modest two-story house came into view, warm light spilling from the living room windows. He paid the driver and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, taking in the sight of home. The garden Lily loved so much was in full bloom, purple and yellow flowers nodding in the evening breeze. Moving with the stealth ingrained by years of military training, James retrieved the spare key from under the ceramic frog by the front steps. The door opened silently. He'd always kept the hinges well oiled. The familiar scent of home wrapped around him. Lavender from Lily's favorite candles, the subtle pine of wood polish. He set his duffel bag down carefully, not wanting to spoil the surprise. The hardwood floors creaked softly under his feet as he moved toward the living room. Then he heard it. Laughter. Lily's musical giggle, followed by a deeper chuckle that made him freeze mid-step. A man's voice, speaking too low to make out the words, but with an intimacy that made James's stomach clench. He inched forward, staying close to the wall. The voices grew clearer as he approached the corner. "I've missed this," the man said softly. "Just talking with you like we used to?" "Me too," Lily replied, her voice warm with affection. "It's been too long." James peered around the corner, his body tensing. The scene before him hit like a physical blow. Lily sat on their beige couch, her honey-brown hair falling loose around her shoulders. Next to her, too close, sat his brother Michael. The brother he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, not since their bitter argument about their parents' care. As James watched, Michael reached out and touched Lily's shoulder, the gesture casual yet intimate. They sat amid scattered photo albums, heads bent close together as they looked at something in Lily's lap. The sight of them together sharing what looked like such a private moment sent a wave of betrayal crashing through him. His hands clenched into fists, jaw tightening as anger rose hot in his chest. All his hopes for a joyful reunion shattered, replaced by questions that felt like shards of glass in his throat. James's combat boots thundered against the hardwood floor as he stormed into the living room, his face flushed with anger. The sudden movement made both Lily and Michael jump, their heads snapping up in unison. The photo album slid from Lily's lap, scattering old pictures across the floor. "Jimmy!" Lily gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Her face drained of color as she took in his uniformed figure standing in the doorway. Michael shot to his feet, stumbling backward. "James, His voice trailed off as he met his brother's blazing eyes. "What the hell is this?" James's voice cut through the room like a knife. His hands trembled at his sides, knuckles white with tension. "My own brother? In my house?" Lily stood up slowly, her movements careful as if approaching a wounded animal. "James, please let me explain." "Explain what?" he spat, his voice rising. "How cozy you two look. How comfortable you are together." He turned his fury toward Michael. "You couldn't wait, could you? The minute I'm deployed—" "It's not what you think," Michael started, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "If you'd just listen—" "Listen," James barked out a harsh laugh. "I've seen enough. My wife and my brother sneaking around behind my back." "Stop it!" Lily's voice cracked like a whip. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her chin was set with determination. She rushed to the coffee table, gathering a stack of wrinkled envelopes bound together with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands shook as she thrust them at James's chest. "Read these first," she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "You need to understand." James stared at the letters as if they might burn him. The top envelope bore his name in Michael's familiar handwriting. The paper yellowed with age. Michael took a tentative step forward. "Jimmy, please, don't." James's voice was raw with emotion. He clutched the letters in one hand and backed away from them both. The hurt and betrayal in his eyes made Lily flinch. Without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hallway. Lily moved to follow him, calling his name, but the bedroom door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the family photos on the walls. Inside the bedroom, James threw his duffel bag across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud before sliding to the floor. He sank onto their bed, and stared at the bundle of letters in his trembling hands. The stack felt heavy, years of unspoken words bound together by that simple blue ribbon. His anger warred with curiosity, with the need to understand what could possibly explain the scene he'd walked in on. He ran his thumb along the edge of the top envelope, fighting the urge to tear them all to pieces. The bedside lamp cast a soft amber glow across the bedroom as James sat on the edge of the mattress. His uniform jacket lay crumpled on the floor where he'd tossed it, his anger having mellowed into a heavy exhaustion. The stack of letters beside him seemed to demand his attention, their worn edges telling a story of frequent handling. With a deep breath, he picked up the first envelope. His hand froze as he recognized his own handwriting, not Michael's as he'd expected. The date stamp showed it was from 2 years ago during his last deployment. His throat tightened as he remembered writing this letter, pouring his heart out to Lily during a particularly difficult night. "My dearest Lily," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Tonight, the stars remind me of your eyes." He remembered writing these words by flashlight in his tent, missing her so desperately it hurt. Letter after letter revealed more memories. His description of a sunset that made him think of her smile, his fears about not making it home, his dreams of their future together. Each one was filled with love, hope, and longing. But as he read, a troubling question emerged. Why had Lily never mentioned receiving these letters? Why had she never responded to his most intimate confessions? The answer came as he examined the envelopes more closely. Though the letters were old, the postmarks were recent, within the last month. And there, on the front of each envelope, was Michael's careful handwriting with their current address. James's stomach twisted as understanding began to dawn. These weren't letters Lily had ignored. They were letters she'd never received. Somehow, Michael had found them and brought them to her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The scene he'd walked in on earlier took on a different meaning. Was that why they'd been sitting so close? Had Michael been sharing these lost pieces of James's heart with Lily? Guilt crept in around the edges of his anger, which still simmered beneath the surface. Yes, the letters explained their closeness tonight, but what about other nights? What about all the times he'd been away? James lay back on the bed, holding one of the letters against his chest. The paper crinkled under his fingers as questions swirled through his mind. His earlier certainty about their betrayal wavered, replaced by confusion and doubt. Sleep tugged at him, but his mind wouldn't quiet. He drifted off, still clutching the letter, his dreams filled with unfinished sentences and unopened envelopes. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the tile floor as James stepped into the room. He'd traded his uniform for a worn t-shirt and jeans, his military bearing softened by a night of restless sleep. Michael sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug, his shoulders tense as he looked up at his brother's approach. "Morning," Michael said quietly, his voice careful and measured. James stood for a moment, his jaw working as he gathered his thoughts. The letters had kept him up most of the night, their contents stirring up memories he'd thought were lost. "Why'd you do it?" he finally asked, pulling out a chair across from Michael. "Why bring the letters now?" Michael set his coffee down, the mug making a soft clink against the wooden table. "I found them when I was cleaning out Mom and Dad's house after—" He swallowed hard. "They were in Dad's old desk, still sealed. I don't know why he never mailed them." "That doesn't explain why you waited to tell me," James said, his words sharp but lacking the previous night's fury. "Because I've always been the one left behind," Michael admitted, his eyes fixed on his coffee. "You were the hero, the Marine, the one making Mom and Dad proud. I was just here, taking care of things while you were gone. I thought maybe if I could get these letters to Lily, help fix something that got broken along the way." He trailed off, shrugging helplessly. James opened his mouth to respond, but movement in the doorway caught his attention. Lily stood there, her face drawn with worry as she looked between the brothers. "James," she said softly, stepping into the kitchen. "Michael's been a friend when I needed one. When the deployments got long and the silence was too much, he wasn't betraying you. He was helping me stay strong for you." James's shoulders tensed, but he nodded slowly. The anger that had burned so hot the night before had cooled, leaving behind questions that needed answers. "All right," he said, meeting Michael's gaze. "I'm listening. Tell me everything." Michael straightened in his chair, hope flickering across his tired features, while Lily's quiet exhale of relief seemed to ease some of the morning's tension. The evening shadows stretched across the living room as James and Lily sat on opposite ends of the couch, the pile of letters between them like a physical manifestation of their unspoken words. The soft ticking of the wall clock punctuated the silence. Upstairs, the occasional creak of floorboards reminded them of Michael's presence, though he'd graciously given them space to talk. James's shoulders remained rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Lily fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, gathering her courage. "I need you to understand something," Lily began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you're deployed, it's like living in suspended animation. Every day I wake up wondering if you're safe, if you're alive." Her voice trembled slightly. "The house feels so empty." James watched her intently, his expression softening as she continued. "This last tour was the hardest. The letters stopped coming and the calls became rare. I'd sit here some nights staring at the phone, praying it wouldn't ring with bad news." Lily wiped at her eyes. "Michael started checking on me after he found me crying in the grocery store parking lot one day. I couldn't even remember why I was there." She reached for one of the letters on the coffee table, running her fingers along its worn edges. "When Michael found these letters, he'd bring one over whenever I felt like giving up. He'd remind me of the man I married, the love we shared. He kept our marriage alive when I was losing hope, James." James's jaw clenched as guilt crept across his features. He'd always pictured Lily as unshakable, handling everything with the same strength he'd fallen in love with. The reality of her struggle hit him like a physical blow. Lily's voice cracked. "I never stopped loving you. Michael was he was the brother you always said he was, looking out for family. He made sure I didn't forget that you'd come home to me someday." James watched as tears rolled down Lily's cheeks. The anger that had consumed him earlier melted away, replaced by a deep shame at how quickly he'd jumped to the worst conclusions. Reaching across the letters, James placed his hand over Lily's. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I didn't realize how hard it was for you. I'm sorry." "I need you to be more present," Lily whispered. "Even when you're away. I need to know I'm not alone." "You won't be," James promised. "Not anymore." Lily gave him a small, grateful smile, the first real smile he'd seen since his return. James stood awkwardly in the doorway of the guest room, watching Michael methodically unpack his duffel bag. The warm, evening light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Neither brother seemed to know quite what to say, but they were trying, making small talk about the weather, about the neighborhood, about anything that felt safe. "Need any help with that?" James finally offered, stepping into the room. Michael glanced up, a fleeting smile crossing his face. "Sure, thanks. You can put those shirts in the dresser." As James moved to help, Michael's bag tipped sideways and something rattled in the side pocket. Without thinking, James reached for it, pulling out an orange prescription bottle. The clinical label caught his eye and his breath caught in his throat as he read the unfamiliar medication name. "What's this for?" James's voice came out sharper than he intended. Michael froze, his hand hovering over a half-folded sweater. The color drained from his face as he stared at the bottle in James's hand. I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" James demanded, his heart beginning to race. "What aren't you saying, Michael?" Michael sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly looking much older than his years. His shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. "It's cancer," he said quietly. "Stage 4. They found it last year." James felt the room tilt slightly. "Last year? And you're just telling me now?" "You were deployed," Michael's voice cracked, "and things between us. They weren't good. I didn't want to burden you with it." "How long?" James's throat felt tight. Michael's eyes met his, filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "The doctors give me maybe 6 months. That's why I brought those letters to Lily. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving with things still broken between us." James stared at the bottle in his hand, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. All his anger from the past few days seemed to evaporate, replaced by a crushing wave of regret. His brother, his little brother, was dying, and he'd spent their precious time together consumed by suspicion and jealousy. Without another word, James turned and walked out of the room, the prescription bottle still clutched in his hand. He made his way to the living room, sinking into an armchair. The bottle's label blurred as he stared at it, his mind racing with all the years they'd lost, all the conversations they'd never had, and now, the time they no longer had. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of James's coffee cup against the table. Early morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm patches across the worn wooden surface. James sat hunched over his coffee, dark circles under his eyes suggesting a sleepless night. Lily padded into the kitchen in her slippers, her hair loosely tied back. She paused in the doorway, studying her husband's troubled expression before joining him at the table. "You look like you haven't slept," she said softly, reaching across to touch his hand. James lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "Michael's dying, Lily. Cancer. He's got maybe 6 months left." Lily's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "Oh no," she whispered. "That's why he's been so determined to—" Her voice trailed off as the pieces fell into place. "To fix things between us," James finished, his voice rough with emotion. "And I've been acting like such a—" He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Lily squeezed his hand tighter. "Jimmy, do you remember when you two were kids? How close you were. Michael used to follow you everywhere, trying to be just like his big brother." A ghost of a smile crossed James's face. "Yeah, I used to get so annoyed sometimes, but he was always there when I needed him." "Then be there for him now," Lily urged gently. "It's not too late to make things right." James nodded slowly, pushing back from the table. He found Michael in the guest room, sitting by the window with a book in his lap. The morning light made his pallor more apparent, the illness visible in the shadows beneath his eyes. "Hey," James said softly, hovering in the doorway. "Got a minute?" Michael looked up, marking his place in the book. "Sure." "I'm sorry," James began, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything I said, for how I've been acting. I was wrong." Michael's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Jimmy." "No, let me finish. Life's too short for this grudge I've been carrying. Way too short." James moved into the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What do you say we take a walk, like we used to? Maybe talk things out?" A smile spread across Michael's face, genuine and warm. "I'd like that." The brothers walked slowly through the quiet neighborhood, their pace matching Michael's more limited stamina. As they talked about their shared past, their hurts, and their hopes, the morning sun rose higher in the sky. When they finally turned back toward home, Michael's steps were tired, but his eyes were bright. James felt something inside him settle, a peace he hadn't expected to find so soon. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the table lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. James sat rigidly on one end of the couch, his shoulders tense and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Across from him, Lily perched on the edge of her seat, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her sweater. Between them, the pile of worn letters on the coffee table seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken words. "James," Lily began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand what it's been like." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "When you're deployed, every day feels like it's stretched into forever. I jump every time the phone rings, wondering if it's good news or—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Running her fingers through her hair, Lily continued. "This last tour was the hardest. The calls became less frequent, and then the letters stopped coming altogether. I'd sit here alone, night after night, trying to convince myself everything was okay." James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, listening. "Michael started dropping by to check on me," Lily explained, her eyes pleading for understanding. "He'd bring groceries sometimes, or just sit and talk. He showed me some of your old letters when I was feeling particularly low." She gestured to the stack on the table. "He'd remind me of the love we share, of the man I married." Tears welled up in her eyes. "He wasn't replacing you, James. He was helping me stay strong for you. When I couldn't reach you, when weeks would go by without a word." Her voice cracked. "Michael helped me keep faith. He'd tell me stories about when you were kids, remind me of the kind of person you are." James's expression softened as he watched his wife struggle with her words. The anger that had been burning in his chest since that first night began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of shame. "I never meant to take you for granted," he said quietly. I thought you were handling everything fine. You always seemed so strong in your videos, in your messages." "I had to be," Lily whispered, wiping away a tear. "I didn't want you to worry about me while you were over there. But James, it's been so hard." James reached across the space between them and placed his hand over hers. "I'm sorry, Lily. I didn't realize how much you were struggling." His voice was thick with emotion. "I promise I'll do better. Even when I'm deployed, I'll find a way to be more present." Lily's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, the first real one he'd seen since his return. James stood in the guest room, awkwardly helping Michael unpack his overnight bag. The silence between them was broken only by the soft rustling of clothes and the occasional clink of personal items being placed on the dresser. "So," James cleared his throat, "how long are you planning to stay?" Michael shrugged, carefully folding a sweater. "I hadn't really thought it through. Maybe a few days, if that's okay." As James reached into a side pocket of the bag to help, his fingers brushed against something hard and cylindrical. He pulled out an orange prescription bottle, his eyes scanning the label automatically. The medication name made his blood run cold. He recognized it from his time visiting wounded Marines in military hospitals. "Michael," James's voice was tight. "Why do you have this?" He held up the bottle, his hand trembling slightly. Michael froze, his face draining of color. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Tell me," James demanded, his voice rising. "Why do you need this medication?" Michael sank onto the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumping. "I was going to tell you," he said quietly. I needed to find the right time." "Tell me what?" James pressed, though deep down he already knew the answer. "I have cancer, Jimmy." Michael's voice cracked as he used James's childhood nickname. "Stage 4. They found it last year." He took a shaky breath. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left." James stared at the bottle in his hand, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. His brother, his little brother, was dying. The anger that had been simmering inside him for days collided with a wave of devastating grief. "That's why I brought you the letters," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving things broken between us. I needed to make things right while I still could." James stood frozen, his mind racing through memories of their childhood, of shared laughter and scraped knees, of the gradual distance that had grown between them. How much time had they wasted? Michael sat on the bed, looking utterly exhausted, the weight of his confession evident in the slump of his shoulders. Without a word, James turned and walked out of the room, the prescription bottle still clutched in his hand. He made his way to the living room, sinking into an armchair. In the dim light, he stared at the bottle, trying to process how everything he thought he knew had changed in an instant. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the wooden table where James sat nursing his coffee. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night. The prescription bottle sat before him like an accusation. Lily padded into the kitchen in her slippers, her face softening with concern as she took in James's haunted expression. Without a word, she poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside him. "Michael's dying," James said quietly, his voice rough. "Cancer. He's got maybe months left." Lily's sharp intake of breath filled the silence. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, James," she whispered. "That's why he's been so determined to make things right." James nodded, his fingers tightening around his mug. "I've been such a fool, Lily. All this time wasted being angry, and now, it's not too late." Lily reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Remember when you two were kids? How close you were? Michael used to follow you everywhere, wanting to be just like his big brother." A ghost of a smile crossed James's face. "He'd wear my old baseball cap everywhere, even to bed." "That love is still there," Lily squeezed his hand. "You both just need to find your way back to it." Later that morning, James stood in the doorway of the guest room. Michael was sitting in the armchair by the window, looking small and tired in the morning light. "Can we talk?" James asked softly. Michael looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Of course." "I'm sorry," James said, stepping into the room. "For everything. For jumping to conclusions. For not being there when Mom and Dad passed. For letting our relationship fall apart." Michael's eyes widened. "James, would you like to take a walk with me? Like we used to?" They strolled through the quiet neighborhood, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. Michael spoke about his admiration for James's service, his regret at their growing distance. James shared stories from his deployments, things he'd never told anyone but Lily. As they rounded the corner back toward home, Michael's steps had slowed, fatigue evident in his careful movements. But his smile, though tired, was genuine. James felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting replaced by a fragile peace. There was still much to discuss, much to repair, but it was a start. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees at Thompson Park, carrying with it the echoes of childhood laughter. James and Michael walked slowly along the familiar path, their footsteps crunching on scattered leaves. The playground equipment had been updated over the years, but the old fishing pond remained unchanged, its surface rippling gently in the morning light. Michael gestured to a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water. "Remember how Dad used to bring us here every Sunday?" His voice was soft, tinged with nostalgia. James nodded, lowering himself onto the bench beside his brother. "Yeah, you always caught more fish than me." "That's because you were too impatient," Michael chuckled, then winced slightly as he adjusted his position. "You'd get frustrated and splash around, scaring them all away." A group of kids ran past them, their excited shouts carrying across the park. Michael watched them with a distant look in his eyes. "You know, after you left for the Marines, Dad would still come here. He'd sit right on this bench telling anyone who'd listen about his son, the hero." James felt a familiar twinge of guilt. "Mike, No, let me finish," Michael said gently. "I stayed behind, running the store, handling their doctor's appointments, paying their bills. When Mom got sick, I was the one who held her hand through chemo. But somehow, in Dad's eyes, I was still just there, not doing anything special." The words hung heavy between them. James stared at the pond, remembering summer evenings spent casting lines with their father, Michael always patiently helping him bait his hook. "I never knew," James said finally. "I mean, I knew you were helping them, but I didn't realize." "How could you? You were off serving our country, winning medals." Michael's voice held no bitterness now, just tired acceptance. "Remember that summer we camped out here, when we tried to catch fireflies in mason jars?" James smiled despite himself. "And you convinced me they were actually tiny aliens?" "You believed me for weeks." Michael laughed softly. "We used to talk about everything back then. Somewhere along the way, we just stopped." "I'm sorry, Mike," James said, turning to face his brother. "I should have seen how much you were carrying. Should have been there more." Michael's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Better late than never, right? As they stood to head back to the car, James reached out and squeezed his brother's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me all this. I want to make things right between us." Michael's smile was genuine, if tired. "Me too, Jimmy. Me too." Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. Lily methodically folded clean towels on the couch, while James sat in his father's old armchair, a leather-bound photo album spread across his lap. The steady rhythm of Lily's movements and the soft rustle of turning pages filled the comfortable silence between them. James's fingers traced the edge of a particular photograph, their wedding day. The image showed him and Lily beaming at the camera, while Michael stood slightly off to the side, his smile genuine but somehow distant. The colors had faded slightly over the years, but the memories remained vivid. "He was so happy for us that day," Lily said softly, noticing James's intense focus on the photo. Even though he barely made it into half the pictures, that was Michael, always trying to stay in the background. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We went to the park today, talked about old times. I never realized—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I never understood what it cost him to stay behind with Mom and Dad while I was off playing hero." Lily set down the half-folded towel she was holding. "You weren't playing hero, James. You were serving your country. But yes, Michael—" She hesitated, then continued more quietly. "He carried a lot of weight while you were gone, not just with your parents." James looked up, meeting her eyes. Lily wrung her hand slightly before continuing. "Those deployments were so hard, especially when the letters stopped coming. There were nights I couldn't sleep, imagining the worst. Michael would stop by, sometimes just to sit with me while I cried. He'd remind me how much you loved me, tell me stories about you two growing up." Tears welled in her eyes. "He fixed the leaky faucet, mowed the lawn when I couldn't face going outside. He kept me going when I felt like I was drowning in worry. Sometimes I felt guilty for needing his help so much, but he never made me feel like a burden." James set the photo album aside and reached for Lily's hands, his own eyes glistening. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you by being strong, by not sharing my fears in those letters. I never stopped to think about what you were going through here alone." Lily squeezed his hands tightly. "You weren't alone in your silence, and I wasn't alone in my fear. Michael understood that better than anyone." James pulled her into a tight embrace as she began to cry softly against his shoulder. "I'll do better," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when I'm away, I'll be here for you. Really here." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table where Michael, James, and Lily sat together. Steam rose from their coffee cups as the aroma of fresh toast and eggs filled the air. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he held his fork, but his eyes were bright with determination. "I've been thinking," Michael said, setting down his utensils. "There's this place that means a lot to me. You remember that old oak tree Mom loved so much? James nodded, memories flooding back of summer afternoons spent climbing its sturdy branches. The one in the park near our old house? Mom used to say it was older than time itself. That's the one, Michael smiled, his voice soft but clear. I'd love to have a small gathering there, with the people who matter most. Something simple but meaningful. Lily's face lit up. That's a wonderful idea. We could make it really special. She reached for her phone, already making notes. What if we invited close friends and family for an afternoon celebration? A proper ceremony, James added, warming to the idea. We could share stories, memories, celebrate you, Michael, while you're here to enjoy it with us. His voice caught slightly on the last words. Michael chuckled weakly. Nothing too fancy, though. You know how I feel about being the center of attention. Oh, let me handle the details, Lily insisted, her enthusiasm infectious. Some light refreshments, maybe some comfortable chairs for everyone. It doesn't have to be elaborate to be beautiful. James leaned forward, memories sparking in his mind. Remember how Mom used to hang those paper lanterns from the lower branches during our family picnics? We could do something like that. Next weekend would be perfect, Michael suggested. The weather's supposed to be nice. I could read that poem you always loved, Lily offered. The one about brothers and time. Michael's eyes moistened as he looked between James and Lily. Their eagerness to create this moment for him was overwhelming. James noticed his brother's emotion and reached across the table, squeezing his hand gently. We'll make it perfect, James promised. Just the way you want it. Michael smiled, his gratitude evident in his expression. Thank you, he said simply, looking at his family. This means more than you know. The morning light continued to fill the kitchen as they finished their breakfast, their hearts full with the promise of the celebration to come. The afternoon sun played hide-and-seek behind gathering storm clouds as James and Lily bustled around the massive oak tree. James carefully hung lanterns from the lower branches, while Lily arranged white folding chairs in neat rows. Michael sat nearby on a wooden bench wrapped in a light jacket despite the warm air. Those clouds don't look too friendly, Michael observed, his voice carrying a hint of worry. James glanced at the darkening horizon. They'll hold off, he said with more confidence than he felt. The weather report said afternoon showers, not storms. Lily smoothed a white tablecloth over a small refreshment table. Everything will be perfect, she assured them, though she kept stealing concerned looks at the sky. The first guests began arriving. Old family friends, cousins, and neighbors who had known the brothers since childhood. Each person approached Michael with warm hugs and gentle words of encouragement. Mrs. Peterson, their former next-door neighbor, pressed a tin of homemade cookies into his hands. Just like I used to make for you boys, she said, wiping away a tear. Michael's eyes grew misty as more people arrived, each bringing memories and kind words. He maintained a brave smile, but James could see the emotion overwhelming his brother. Just as everyone was taking their seats and James was about to begin his welcome speech, the first fat raindrops fell. Within seconds, the gentle sprinkle transformed into a sudden downpour. Quick, to the pavilion, Lily called out, already helping elderly guests to their feet. People scattered, holding jackets and purses over their heads as they ran for cover. James grabbed Michael's arm, supporting him as they hurried to the nearby shelter. They arrived at the wooden pavilion soaking wet, their dress shirts clinging to their skin. To James's surprise, Michael started laughing, a genuine, hearty laugh that reminded him of their childhood. Well, this is fitting, Michael chuckled, water dripping from his hair. Remember when Mom's garden party got rained out in '95? She just served the entire dinner in the garage. James joined in the laughter, both of them alone for a moment as other guests sought shelter elsewhere. The rain drummed steadily on the pavilion roof, creating a cozy cocoon of privacy. James, Michael said, his tone growing serious. There's something I never told you about Lily. James turned to his brother, noting the sudden change in his expression. Before you proposed to her, Michael continued, she came to me full of doubts, not about loving you, never about that. But she was scared about being a military wife, about the long separations and the uncertainty. James felt his chest tighten. What happened? I told her that if anyone could handle it, she could. That you two were meant for each other. That love like yours was worth fighting for. Michael's voice grew soft. I knew you'd need someone strong like her, and I knew she loved you enough to be that person. The revelation hit James like a physical weight. All these years, Michael had been quietly supporting his happiness, making sacrifices James never knew about. The realization left him feeling both grateful and uncomfortable, struggling to process this new understanding of his brother's role in his life. The rain began to ease, and they could hear voices approaching as guests ventured back toward the oak tree. James looked at his brother, seeing him in a new light, not just as his sibling, but as someone who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. 2 days after the rain-soaked gathering, sunlight streamed through the guest room window as James helped Michael sort through boxes of decorations. The morning air felt heavy with unspoken words between them. Michael moved slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he unwrapped delicate glass ornaments. These will look beautiful on the tree, Michael said softly, holding up a crystal sun catcher. James nodded, reaching into another box. His hand brushed against something that felt like paper. He pulled out a worn envelope with his own name written across the front in his handwriting. Curious, he opened it. As his eyes scanned the familiar words, his heart began to race. The letter was dated 5 years ago, during his second deployment. In it, he had poured out his deepest fears about failing as a husband, about not being able to give Lily the life she deserved while serving his country. "What is this?" James's voice cracked with emotion. "Why wasn't this delivered?" Michael set down the ornament he was holding, his face pale. "I found it with the others, but this one, I thought it might hurt more than help." "That wasn't your decision to make," James said, his voice rising. "You had no right to keep this from Lily." "She was struggling enough," Michael defended. "She needed to believe in your strength, not doubt." "You played with our lives." James stood up, the letter crumpling in his fist. "You decided what we should know, what we should feel. Who gave you that right?" Michael pushed himself up from his chair, swaying slightly. "I was trying to protect both of you. If you could have seen how fragile she was." "Stop it!" James cut him off. "Just stop trying to control everything." Michael took a step forward, his face contorted with emotion. "James, please, I never meant to—" His words cut off abruptly as his legs buckled beneath him. His eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor. "Michael!" James lunged forward, catching his brother's head before it hit the ground. "Lily! Lily! Call an ambulance!" The next hour passed in a blur of paramedics, sirens, and sterile hospital corridors. Now, James sat beside Michael's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of monitors. Tubes and wires seemed to swallow his brother's frail form. "I'm sorry," James whispered into the quiet room. His earlier anger dissolved into guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry." The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the quiet room as James sat vigil by Michael's bedside. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows across Michael's pale face, making him look even more fragile than before. James hadn't moved from his chair for hours, his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his brother's chest. The door opened with a soft click as Lily entered, carrying a cardboard tray with 3 coffee cups. The familiar scent of hospital coffee, strong and slightly burnt, wafted through the room. "Here," she whispered, placing a cup in front of James. "You need this." James wrapped his hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I did this to him, Lily. I pushed him too hard." Lily pulled up another chair and sat beside him, her shoulder touching his. "Tell me what happened." James took a shaky breath. "I found a letter, one I wrote years ago. Michael had kept it from you." He explained about the contents, about his fears of failing as a husband, about the argument that followed. "I was so angry that he'd hidden it, I didn't stop to think about why." "Oh, James," Lily sighed, placing her hand over his. "Michael has always tried to protect us, even when his methods weren't perfect." A nurse entered quietly, checking Michael's vitals. As she adjusted his IV, Michael's eyelids fluttered. James leaned forward, hope and fear warring in his chest. Michael's eyes opened slowly, focusing first on the ceiling, then drifting to James. His lips moved, trying to form words. "I'm so sorry," James whispered, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have gotten so angry. I shouldn't have." Michael's hand twitched and James grasped it gently. Despite his weakness, Michael managed a small squeeze. "Needed to know." Michael breathed out each word an effort. "No more secrets." James bowed his head, tears finally spilling over. "No more secrets," he agreed. "Just rest now. I'm not going anywhere." Through the night, James maintained his vigil, holding his brother's hand. The anger that had fueled their argument earlier felt distant now, replaced by a deep appreciation for the time they had left together. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window as James balanced a tray of breakfast items from the cafeteria. Michael sat propped up against his pillows, looking more alert than he had the night before. Though still pale, some color had returned to his cheeks. "Hospital eggs," James announced, setting the tray down. "Probably terrible, but better than nothing." Michael managed a small smile. "Thanks. Beats the IV dinner from last night." As Michael picked at his breakfast, James settled into the chair beside him. The question that had been nagging at him all night finally surfaced. "Mike, about those letters. Why did you really keep them?" Michael set his fork down, his hands trembling slightly. "You were out there, serving our country. The last thing you needed was to worry about how your doubts might affect Lily." "But they were my feelings to share," James said softly, without the anger from before. "I know." Michael's voice was quiet. "Truth is, I felt like such a disappointment. Dad always talked about how proud he was of you, his Marine son. Meanwhile, I was just there, taking care of things at home." He paused, gathering strength. "Protecting Lily, making sure she stayed strong for you. It was the one thing I could do right." James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You were never a disappointment, Mike. I was the one who failed to see how much you were doing for everyone." "Water under the bridge now," Michael said, attempting a smile. "Hey, about the ceremony." "We don't have to worry about that right now," James started, but Michael shook his head. "I want to. It gives me something to focus on besides these four walls." James pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "All right then, let's make it perfect this time." While Michael rested later that morning, James sought out Michael's doctor. The prognosis was what he'd feared. Weeks, maybe a month or two at most. James thanked the doctor, his jaw set with determination. Whatever time they had left, he would make it count. Back in the room, James settled into his chair and began sketching layout ideas for the ceremony, glancing occasionally at his sleeping brother. The pencil moved across the paper with purpose, each detail carefully considered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room as James, Michael, and Lily gathered to finalize plans for the rescheduled ceremony. Michael rested on the couch, his face showing the strain of the past few days, but his eyes remained alert and engaged as they discussed flower arrangements and seating. "Maybe we should take a break," Lily suggested, setting aside her notebook. "There's something we need to talk about." James and Michael exchanged uncertain glances. "I've watched you both for years," Lily continued, her voice gentle but firm. "And I've seen how much love there is between you even when you couldn't see it yourselves. You're both remarkable men, but in different ways." Michael shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Lily, we don't need to." "Yes, we do," she interrupted softly. "James, when you were deployed, Michael was here, holding this family together. And Michael, while you felt overlooked, James was carrying the weight of protecting not just us, but our country." James leaned forward in his chair. "She's right, Mike. I never really understood what you went through staying behind, taking care of Mom and Dad, supporting Lily. I was so focused on my duty that I forgot about my duty to you." Michael's eyes glistened. "I was proud of you, Jimmy. I really was. But sometimes it felt like nothing I did could measure up. You were out there being a hero, and I was just here. Being here was heroic too. James said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have told you that years ago. Lily reached out, taking each of their hands in hers. We've all been carrying so much, but right now, in this moment, we have a choice. We can hold on to old hurts, or we can choose love and understanding. I choose love, Michael said quietly, squeezing Lily's hand. James nodded, reaching over to grasp his brother's free hand. Me too. No more misunderstandings. No more rivalry. The three sat connected in their circle, letting the moment wash over them. A peaceful smile crossed Michael's face as he met his brother's gaze, and James returned it with equal warmth. Lily pulled them both into a gentle embrace, grateful to see the healing that had begun. The morning sun filtered through the oak tree's leaves, creating dappled patterns on the ground as James, Lily, and Michael arrived at the park. James helped Michael settle onto a sturdy wooden bench, while Lily spread out their planning materials on a nearby picnic table. This spot is perfect, Michael said, his voice soft but content. Remember all those summer picnics Mom used to organize here? James smiled as he paced the area, measuring tape in hand. Yeah, she'd pack those enormous baskets full of sandwiches. Way too much food for just us. She always said better too much than too little, Lily chimed in, sketching a rough layout of the space. I was thinking, what if we create a photo display? We could gather pictures from throughout your life, Michael, your happiest moments. Michael's face lit up. That would be wonderful. There's that picture from my high school graduation where Mom insisted on fixing my cap for the 100th time. Oh, and the one from that fishing trip where you caught that huge bass, James added, pausing his measurements. Dad was so proud. As they worked, Michael watched his brother and Lily move efficiently around the space, marking spots for chairs and planning where to hang the lanterns. His eyes drifted to the thick branches overhead. Mom used to tie ribbons in this tree, he said suddenly. Remember, Jimmy? Pink and white ones, for Easter. James stopped what he was doing and looked up. That's right. She said they made the tree look magical. We should do that, Lily suggested warmly. We could tie ribbons for the ceremony. I think I even have some in the car from the first attempt. James retrieved a long white ribbon from Lily's craft supplies. With careful movements, he tied it to a low-hanging branch, making sure the bow was perfect. This one's for Mom, he said quietly. Michael nodded, his eyes glistening. This means everything to me, you know. Having both of you here, making this happen, it's more than I could have hoped for. We wouldn't have it any other way, James replied, helping Michael stand as they prepared to leave. At the car, Michael turned to them both. Thank you, he said simply, for giving me this sense of completion. James squeezed his brother's shoulder, the gesture conveying more than words could express. Golden afternoon light streamed through the oak tree's branches, casting warm shadows across the gathering. Ribbons in shades of blue and green danced in the gentle breeze, while paper lanterns hung like delicate ornaments from the sturdy limbs. The photo board near the tree trunk displayed snapshots of Michael's life, childhood pictures of two brothers playing baseball, family holiday gatherings, and quiet moments that captured his gentle spirit. Michael sat in a cushioned chair beneath the tree, wearing a crisp button-down shirt that seemed a bit loose on his thin frame. Despite his obvious fatigue, his eyes sparkled as each guest approached to greet him. James stood nearby, one hand resting protectively on the back of Michael's chair. "How are you holding up?" James asked softly, leaning down to check on his brother. "I'm good," Michael replied with a genuine smile. "Really good." Lily moved gracefully through the crowd, directing people to their seats and ensuring everything was in place. She'd arranged chairs in a semicircle around the tree, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt both casual and sacred. When everyone was settled, Michael's closest friend David stood to read the chosen poem. His voice carried clearly across the gathering as he recited words about forgiveness, love, and the bridges we build between hearts. Many guests dabbed at their eyes, touched by the poem's meaning and the occasion that brought them together. Michael's speech came next, Though his voice was quiet, everyone leaned in to catch every word as he expressed his gratitude for their presence and support. "Life is too short for anger," he said, his gaze finding James's. "Too precious to waste on misunderstandings." James took his turn at speaking, his military bearing softening as he shared stories of their childhood adventures under this very tree. "Michael was always the one who made sure I didn't climb too high," he said, choking up slightly. "He's still looking out for me even now. I just wish I'd seen it sooner." The ceremony concluded with each guest approaching the tree to tie their ribbon among the branches. The colorful strips fluttered like prayers in the evening air, each one representing a memory, a wish, or a silent goodbye. As the last guests departed, Michael remained seated beneath the tree with James and Lily beside him. The lanterns began to glow softly in the fading light, creating a magical atmosphere. Michael watched them sway gently overhead. "This is exactly what I needed," he whispered, contentment evident in his voice. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of Michael's room, casting gentle shadows on the pale blue walls. James sat in the worn armchair beside the bed, watching his brother's labored breathing. The medical equipment hummed quietly in the background, a constant reminder of Michael's declining condition. "Hey, Mike," James said softly as Michael's eyes fluttered open. "How about we read some more of that book you love?" Michael managed a weak smile and nodded. His face had grown gaunt over the past week, his skin taking on an almost translucent quality. James picked up the dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea from the nightstand, finding their bookmark. As James read, his voice steady and warm, Michael drifted in and out of consciousness. Lily appeared in the doorway with a tray holding a bowl of soup and Michael's morning medications. She set it down quietly, touching James's shoulder before leaving them alone again. "James," Michael whispered during a pause in the reading, Could you get something for me?" James leaned forward, straining to hear his brother's faint voice. "Anything, Mike. What do you need?" "There's a wooden box in the closet, top shelf." James found the box easily, a simple wooden container with worn edges and a slightly loose hinge. He brought it to Michael, who gestured weakly for him to open it. Inside, memories of their shared childhood lay carefully preserved. James lifted out an old brass compass, its face scratched but still functional. "Remember when Dad gave us this?" he asked, his throat tightening. "For our first camping trip?" Michael's eyes brightened slightly. "You got us lost anyway," he whispered. James chuckled softly, pulling out a fishing lure next, red and white, with a slightly bent hook. "And this one? This caught that monster bass at Miller's Pond." "You screamed, Mum, when it jumped," Michael said, each word requiring visible effort. At the bottom of the box lay a photograph, creased at the corners but well preserved. Two young boys grinned at the camera, their arms around each other's shoulders, fishing poles in hand. James stared at their young faces, remembering the simple joy of those summer days. Michael's eyes began to close, the effort of reminiscing clearly exhausting him. James carefully arranged the photo on the bedside table where Michael could see it easily. "I'll take care of everything, Mike," James whispered, watching his brother drift off. "You just rest." He stood quietly and left the room, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't express. James sat in the dimly lit room, the only sound being Michael's steady breathing and the soft whir of medical equipment. The bedside lamp cast a warm glow over scattered belongings, photos, books, and various papers that told the story of his brother's life. As he sorted through items on the bedside table, a cream-colored envelope caught his eye. His name was written across the front in Michael's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, James opened it and began to read. "Dear Jimmy, I've started this letter 100 times but could never find the right words. Maybe knowing my time is short has finally given me the courage to be honest. I've always been jealous of you. From the day you earned your Marine Corps uniform, to every medal and commendation that followed. While you were out there being a hero, I was just Mike, the brother who stayed behind. Sometimes that envy ate away at me like acid. But here's what I never told you. You were always my hero, even before the uniform. Remember when you stood up to Tommy Jenkins in 6th grade when he was bullying me? Or how you taught me to throw a curveball even though it took all summer? That's the brother I've always looked up to. I know I should have said this years ago, but I'm so proud to be your brother. Even when I felt invisible in your shadow, I never stopped admiring the man you became. Your strength, your dedication to duty, your love for Lily. These things inspired me more than you'll ever know. I kept those letters you wrote because they showed me the Jimmy I always knew was there, the one who doubted himself sometimes but never gave up. I wanted to protect that vulnerable side of you, maybe because it made me feel needed in some small way. I hope you can forgive me for not being braver, for letting jealousy and pride keep us apart for so long. Your brother always, Michael. Tears rolled down James's cheeks as he finished reading. He looked at Michael's peaceful face, understanding finally washing over him like a gentle wave. Moving his chair closer to the bed, James began reading the letter aloud, his voice soft but steady. "Dear Jimmy," he started again, watching as the faintest smile touched Michael's lips. Though Michael's eyes remained closed, James knew his brother heard every word, every confession, every expression of love that had gone unspoken for too long. The morning sunlight filtered through the living room windows as Pastor Thompson's familiar figure appeared at the door. His kind eyes crinkled with concern as Lily welcomed him inside. The pastor had known the Carter brothers since they were young boys racing through Sunday school halls, and seeing him brought an immediate sense of comfort to the household. "It's good to see you, Pastor," James said quietly, embracing his old friend. Pastor Thompson made his way to Michael's room first, carrying his well-worn Bible under his arm. Michael's face brightened at the sight of him, some of the tension leaving his tired features. "Remember that time you boys convinced me to let you ring the church bell?" Pastor Thompson chuckled, settling into the chair beside Michael's bed. "Nearly gave poor Mrs. Henderson a heart attack during her afternoon nap." Michael's laugh was weak but genuine. Jimmy was the mastermind behind that one. The pastor reached out and took Michael's hand, offering a quiet prayer that filled the room with peace. They talked softly about childhood memories, about faith, and about finding strength in difficult times. Michael seemed to draw energy from the conversation, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. Later, Pastor Thompson found James alone in the kitchen, staring into an untouched cup of coffee. "Walk with me a moment, James," he suggested gently. In the backyard, James finally let his guard down. "I wasted so much time, Pastor. All those years I could have been a better brother." "The Lord works in his own time," Pastor Thompson replied, placing a steadying hand on James's shoulder. "What matters is that you're here now, that you've opened your heart to reconciliation. That's what Michael needed most." At Michael's request, they gathered in the living room, James, Michael, and Pastor Thompson. The pastor sat between the brothers like he used to during their childhood squabbles, but this time his presence brought unity rather than mediation. "I'd like us to pray together," Pastor Thompson suggested, "and give thanks for this precious time of healing." As they bowed their heads, the pastor's warm voice filled the room with words of gratitude and love. James felt tears sliding down his cheeks, but they were different from the bitter ones he'd shed before. These were tears of relief, of acceptance, of peace. After Pastor Thompson departed, James remained by Michael's side. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, but the heaviness in James's heart had lifted. He watched his brother rest, thankful for every quiet moment they now shared. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, a gentle breeze rustling through the curtains of Michael's bedroom. James sat in his usual spot beside the bed, his hand resting gently over his brother's frail fingers. Michael's eyes fluttered open, and though his voice was barely more than a whisper, there was an urgency in his tone. "Jimmy," he breathed, using James's childhood nickname, "I want to see the lake one more time." James felt his heart tighten. "The lake? Mike, I don't know if you're strong enough." "Please," Michael insisted, his eyes bright with determination. "Remember how Dad taught us to fish there? Those were the best days." Lily appeared in the doorway, her face softening as she watched the brothers. "We could make it work, James. We'll bring plenty of blankets, make him comfortable." James looked between them, torn between concern for Michael's health and the desperate wish in his brother's eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, Mike. We'll go tomorrow morning." The next day, James and Lily transformed the back seat of their car into a makeshift bed, layering it with soft blankets and pillows. Michael's face lit up when he saw their preparations, a ghost of his old smile crossing his features. During the drive, Michael's quiet voice drifted from the back seat. "Remember when Dad would wake us up before sunrise? We'd complain the whole way there." James chuckled. "Until he broke out those peanut butter sandwiches Mom packed. And we'd fight over who got the bigger half," Michael added, his laugh turning into a soft cough. The lake appeared before them, its surface gleaming like polished glass in the late afternoon sun. James parked close to their old fishing spot, where a weathered bench still overlooked the water. With careful movements, James helped Michael from the car. His brother's weight felt impossibly light against his shoulder as they made their way to the bench. Together, they settled onto the worn wood, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant golds and pinks. Michael closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath of the familiar lake air. His face relaxed, years of pain and worry seeming to melt away in the peaceful moment. James sat beside him, their shoulders touching, feeling a profound connection in their shared silence. The setting sun painted the lake in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the water. James, Michael, and Lily huddled together on the old wooden bench, wrapped in thick blankets against the evening chill. Michael's breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes fixed on the spectacular sunset before them. "Thank you both," Michael whispered, his voice barely carrying over the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. "This is exactly how I wanted to spend these days. Right here, with the people I love most." He turned to Lily, his eyes bright despite his weakness. "Lily, you've been our anchor through everything. The way you held this family together, even in the darkest times." He paused, gathering strength. "Your compassion and strength amazed me every single day. You're the glue that kept us from falling apart." Lily squeezed his hand gently, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. Michael shifted his gaze to James, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And you, Jimmy, I need you to know how proud I am of the man you've become. Remember when we were kids? We'd sit right here, dreaming about what we'd do when we grew up?" He chuckled softly. "You've exceeded every one of those dreams, brother." A memory sparked in Michael's eyes, and he let out a weak laugh. "Remember that time you tried to show off your casting technique? Ended up face first in the lake instead?" James and Lily joined in the gentle laughter, the sound mixing with the evening breeze. "That water was freezing," James recalled, his voice thick with emotion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening purples, Michael leaned against his brother's shoulder. His breathing grew slower, more peaceful. A serene smile settled on his face as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. James held his brother close, feeling the subtle change as Michael's spirit quietly slipped away. Lily's hand found James's, and together they sat in profound silence, bearing witness to this moment of both heartbreak and grace. Soft afternoon light filtered through the curtains of the Carter family home, casting a gentle glow on the collection of photos displaying Michael's smiling face. The living room, transformed into an intimate memorial space, held the quiet murmur of gathered friends and family. Candles flickered on side tables, their warm light reflecting off the glass frames of countless memories. Pastor Thompson stood near the fireplace, his weathered face kind as he addressed the small crowd. "Michael Carter had a way of bringing out the best in people," he began, his voice steady and warm. "He showed us that true strength isn't about being the loudest or the most successful, but about being there for others when they need you most." Lily stepped forward, holding a worn piece of paper in trembling hands. James moved closer, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder as she began reading Michael's favorite poem. Her voice wavered but grew stronger with each line, just as Michael would have wanted. "The oak stands tall through storms and rain, its branches reaching wide," she read, tears glistening in her eyes. "Like love that spans the distance, keeping family side by side." One by one, guests shared their stories. Aunt Martha recalled how Michael had spent every Sunday for a year helping her repair her old house after her husband passed. A childhood friend described Michael's infamous attempt to catch fireflies in mason jars, only to trip and scatter them all across the backyard, creating an accidental light show that delighted the neighborhood kids. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood tall in his dress uniform, though his eyes were red-rimmed. "My brother taught me more in his final weeks than I learned in all my years of service," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He showed me that courage isn't just about facing danger. It's about facing your mistakes and choosing love over pride." As the afternoon drew to a close, the gathered friends and family made their way to the oak tree in the yard. Each person carried a colorful ribbon, continuing the tradition that had meant so much to Michael. The tree's branches swayed gently as dozens of ribbons were carefully tied, each one representing a life touched by Michael's presence. After the last guest departed, James stood alone beneath the oak tree, holding one final ribbon, deep blue, Michael's favorite color. His fingers worked carefully as he secured it to a branch, watching it dance in the breeze. "I'll make you proud, Mike," he whispered before turning back toward the house where Lily waited, her arms outstretched to welcome him home. Sunlight streamed through Michael's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor where cardboard boxes sat waiting to be filled. James and Lily moved quietly through the room, carefully sorting through Michael's belongings. Each item they touched held a memory, making the task both precious and painful. "Look at this old baseball cap," Lily said softly, holding up a faded blue hat. "He wore this every time he worked in the garden." James nodded, running his fingers along the worn brim. As he reached to place it in the keep box, his hand brushed against something under Michael's pillow. Curious, he pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with use. "I didn't know he kept a journal," James murmured, settling onto the edge of the bed. Lily sat beside him as he carefully opened it. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. Michael's neat handwriting filled page after page with thoughts, dreams, and deeply personal reflections. James's throat tightened as he read passages about Michael's struggles with feeling overshadowed and inadequate. "Sometimes I watch James on TV receiving another commendation and I feel so small," James read aloud, his voice catching. "But then I remember his strength is different from mine. His path isn't mine to walk." Lily squeezed his hand as they continued reading. Later entries showed Michael's perspective shifting, especially during their final weeks together. "Today, James and I walked in the park," James read from a recent entry. "For the first time in years, I felt like his brother again, not his shadow. Maybe our story could help others understand it's never too late for forgiveness." Near the end of the journal, they found an entry addressed directly to James. "Dear Jimmy, if you're reading this, I hope you understand now how much I've always admired you. Use your strength to help others find their way back to family. That's what matters most in the end." James closed the journal gently, holding it against his chest. "He wanted to share our story," he said quietly. "Help other families heal." Moving to Michael's desk, James opened the journal to its final blank pages. He picked up a pen, his hand steady as he wrote, "For Michael, who taught me the true meaning of love and forgiveness." The community center buzzed with quiet activity as James walked through its worn double doors. The smell of coffee and cleaning supplies filled the air, reminding him of his early days in the military, places where people came together with purpose. Sarah Martinez, the program director, greeted him with a warm handshake. Her eyes were kind but evaluating as she led him to her small office. Family photos and children's artwork decorated the walls, creating an atmosphere of trust and comfort. "Tell me what brings you here, Mr. Carter," Sarah said, gesturing for him to take a seat. James pulled Michael's journal from his bag, holding it carefully. "My brother passed away recently," he began, his voice steady. "Before he died, we managed to heal years of misunderstandings and hurt. He left behind this journal full of wisdom about forgiveness and family bonds." Sarah leaned forward, genuinely interested. "And you want to share these lessons?" "Yes," James nodded. Michael had this way of seeing through anger to what really mattered. "I was a Marine captain, so I understand discipline and leadership. But my brother taught me about emotional courage, Sarah smiled, tapping her pen thoughtfully. We have a group of young men, ages 16 to 19. Many come from military families, actually. They're struggling with trust issues, anger, feelings I suspect you understand well. I do, James admitted. I almost lost my chance to reconcile with Michael because of my own anger. The following week, James stood before 6 teenagers in a circle of chairs. Their body language screamed defensiveness, crossed arms, averted eyes, slouched postures. James opened Michael's journal and began reading about the day he'd stormed into the house, assuming the worst about his brother. As he shared the story of their journey to forgiveness, he noticed subtle changes. One boy uncrossed his arms, another sat up straighter. By the time James described their final days at the lake, all 6 were fully engaged. My brother taught me that pride and anger only rob us of time with the people we love, James concluded. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. The questions came hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness. One boy admitted he hadn't spoken to his father in 2 years. Another shared his struggles with his younger brother's success in school. That evening, James sat with Lily on their back porch, describing how the session had gone. You should have seen their faces when I talked about Michael, he said. It was like they could see themselves in our story. Lily squeezed his hand. Michael would be so proud of you, James. You're turning your pain into purpose. The evening light filtered through the study window, casting long shadows across James's desk. Papers and books lay scattered around him, each one a piece of the story he was trying to tell. Michael's journal sat open beside him, its pages well worn from constant reference. The framed photo of 2 young boys holding fishing poles caught the fading sunlight, making their smiles seem to glow. James picked up his pen and began writing, his hand steady despite the weight in his heart. Dear Emma, he started, addressing his future granddaughter. There are things about our family you need to know. He paused, glancing at Michael's journal. The familiar handwriting brought comfort as he searched for the right words. Stories flowed from his memories. Tales of brotherhood, sacrifice, and redemption. He wrote about the power of forgiveness, drawing from his own experience with Michael. Your great-uncle Michael taught me that pride can blind us to what matters most, he wrote. It took me too long to see the truth, but when I did, it changed everything. Sometimes the words came easily, rushing onto the page like a river breaking free. Other times, James would stop, overcome by emotion. During these moments, he'd turn to Michael's journal, finding strength in his brother's wisdom. Being brave isn't about never feeling fear, he wrote in another letter, thinking of Michael's final days. It's about facing that fear with an open heart. Each letter held a different lesson, about family, about love, about the courage to be vulnerable. James sealed them carefully, writing dates and occasions on each envelope. High school graduation, wedding day, first child. As he placed the letters in the wooden box, James felt lighter somehow. The photo of him and Michael seemed to watch over him, a reminder of simpler times and deeper truths. I'll make sure they remember you, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. Lily sat nervously in the small office, her hands clasped in her lap as she faced Sarah Thompson, the coordinator for Military Family Support Services. Sunlight streamed through the narrow window, warming the cramped space filled with filing cabinets and motivational posters. So tell me, Sarah said, leaning forward with genuine interest. What made you want to reach out to our organization? Lily took a deep breath. I've been a military wife for 12 years now, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. And I've learned that the hardest part isn't always the separation. It's feeling like no one else understands what you're going through. She shared her story, describing the lonely nights and the struggle to maintain connection during James's deployments. Her voice cracked slightly as she mentioned Michael's support during those difficult times. Sometimes just having someone to talk to made all the difference, Lily explained. That's what I want to offer other spouses, a safe place to share their fears and hopes. Sarah nodded thoughtfully before saying, Would you consider leading some of our support groups? Your experience could help so many others. A week later, Lily found herself facing a circle of military spouses in the community center's meeting room. Her heart pounded as she introduced herself, but the nervous energy transformed into purpose as she began sharing her journey. "Communication isn't just about the words we say," she told the group. "It's about finding ways to stay connected even when you're apart." A young woman named Rachel wiped tears from her eyes as she shared her own struggles with her husband's first deployment. Lily reached out and squeezed her hand, offering the same comfort Michael had once given her. "You're not alone," Lily assured her, sharing practical tips about maintaining emotional intimacy through letters and creating special traditions for homecomings. After the session, several participants lingered to thank her. Their grateful words filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. That evening, as Lily checked her email at home, a message from Rachel appeared on her screen. She called James over to read it together. "Dear Lily, today's session gave me hope for the first time since Mark deployed. Thank you for showing me it's possible to not just survive this life, but to thrive in it." James wrapped his arm around Lily's shoulders. "You're making a difference," he said softly, "just like Michael wanted." The local bookstore buzzed with quiet energy as James sat behind a table stacked with freshly printed copies of Letters to Forgiveness. The cover featured a simple design, an oak tree silhouetted against a sunset sky. Lily stood nearby, greeting guests with warm smiles as they filed in. James adjusted his collar, feeling both nervous and proud. The small crowd gathered in front of him represented more than just potential readers. They were witnesses to Michael's lasting impact. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice steady but emotional. "This book started as my brother Michael's personal journal. He left it to me before he passed away 6 months ago, and through his words I discovered a depth of love and wisdom I hadn't fully appreciated while he was alive." He picked up a copy of the book and opened it to a marked page. "I'd like to share one of Michael's entries with you," he said, clearing his throat. "Today I realized that holding on to anger is like carrying a boulder uphill. The longer you hold it, the heavier it becomes. I've spent years resenting James's success, but what did that accomplish? Nothing but exhaustion. The moment I chose to let go, to celebrate his achievements instead of envying them, I felt lighter. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, choosing to set down our burdens and walk freely again." The room fell silent as James's words settled. A man in the front row wiped his eyes with his sleeve. During the Q&A session, that same man stood up. "I read an early excerpt in the local paper," he said, voice trembling. "I hadn't spoken to my brother in 15 years. After reading about your journey with Michael, I called him. We're having dinner next week." He paused, struggling to maintain composure. "Thank you for sharing your story. It gave me the push I needed." James spent the next hour signing books, each interaction more meaningful than the last. People shared their own stories of estrangement, reconciliation, and hope. He wrote personal messages in each copy, channeling Michael's spirit of compassion. After the event, James and Lily walked to the oak tree in the park. The setting sun cast long shadows through its branches, where dozens of ribbons still danced in the evening breeze. James pulled a new ribbon from his pocket. This one matched the blue of the book's cover. As he tied it to a low-hanging branch, he whispered, "This one's for you, Mike." James sat at the dining room table, surrounded by papers and photographs. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on Michael's smiling face in a photo from the oak tree ceremony. Lily stood behind him, sorting through a stack of forms and documents. "You know what keeps coming back to me?" James said, picking up the photo. "How Michael always put others first, even when he was struggling himself." Lily squeezed his shoulder. "He'd be proud to see you carrying that forward." "I've been thinking," James continued, pulling out a notepad. "What if we started a scholarship fund in Michael's name? Something to help kids who might not otherwise get a chance." "That's perfect," Lily said, her eyes lighting up. "And we could focus on students who show the same kind of spirit Michael had, that willingness to put others first. Maybe even expand it beyond just education," James added. "Programs that help people learn to forgive, to heal family rifts before it's too late." Lily grabbed her phone and dialed Pastor Thompson's number. When he answered, she put him on speaker. The pastor listened intently as they shared their vision. "This is exactly what our community needs," Pastor Thompson said warmly. "I can help connect you with local organizations and spread the word through the church network." They organized a meeting with potential donors in their living room the following week. James shared Michael's story, his voice steady and passionate, as he described their journey from estrangement to reconciliation. "The Michael Carter Foundation will be more than just financial support," James explained to the gathered group. "It's about creating opportunities for healing and understanding." The response was immediate and heartfelt. Several attendees wrote checks on the spot, while others pledged ongoing support. One businessman, wiping tears from his eyes, offered to match all donations for the first year. By the end of the meeting, they had settled on the official name, the Michael Carter Foundation, a legacy of forgiveness and hope. A week later, James held the foundation's first check in his hands. It was made out to the local high school, designated for a student who embodied Michael's spirit of compassion and resilience. As he sealed the envelope, James felt a deep sense of rightness. Michael's story would continue to touch lives, creating ripples of healing and hope far beyond their family. The autumn breeze rustled through the oak tree's branches as James settled onto the weathered bench beneath it. His notebook lay open on his lap, pen poised above the blank page. The familiar weight of Michael's absence pressed against his heart, but it felt different now. Less sharp, more like a gentle reminder of everything his brother had taught him. "Dear Michael," he wrote, his handwriting steady and clear. "It's been a year since you left us, but in many ways, it feels like you've never been closer." James paused, watching a leaf spiral down from the tree. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, creating patterns on the paper that reminded him of the lanterns from Michael's ceremony. "Your book, our book really, has touched so many lives. Letters to Forgiveness is in its third printing now. Every week I get letters from people who say it helped them reach out to their own estranged family members. You'd laugh at how many speaking engagements I've done. Me, the guy who used to hate giving presentations in school." A smile tugged at James's lips as he continued writing. "The foundation is growing faster than we ever imagined. Last month, we awarded our first round of scholarships to 5 incredible students. Each one of them reminds me of you somehow. That same quiet strength, that determination to help others even when facing their own struggles." James shifted on the bench, his throat tightening. "But you know what matters most? I'm learning to be the kind of brother you always saw in me. The kind of man you knew I could be. Lily says I'm softer now, more willing to listen and understand. That's your influence, Mike. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the key to real connection." The pen moved steadily across the page as James poured out his heart. "I miss our talks. I miss your laugh. But mostly I'm grateful. Grateful that we had those final weeks together. Grateful that you gave me the chance to understand what really matters. You showed me that it's never too late to choose love over pride, forgiveness over anger." James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I promise to keep your spirit alive in everything I do. Every life we touch through the foundation, every family that finds healing through your story, it's all part of your legacy." He signed the letter with a simple "Love, James," and carefully folded the pages. Standing, he pulled a blue ribbon from his pocket, the same shade as the one from Michael's ceremony. With gentle hands, he tied the letter to a low-hanging branch, watching it flutter in the breeze. The gentle lapping of lake water against the shore provided a soothing backdrop as James and Lily spread their checkered blanket on the grassy bank. Their children, Emma and Thomas, chased each other near the water's edge, their giggles carrying across the peaceful evening air. "Be careful, you two," Lily called out, though her voice held more affection than concern. She leaned against James's shoulder, their fingers naturally intertwining. "I was at the oak tree today," James said softly, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Writing to Michael." Lily squeezed his hand. "What did you tell him?" "Everything. About the book, the foundation, how many lives he's still touching." James's voice grew thick with emotion. "Remember how he used to sit right here, teaching Emma to skip stones?" He had infinite patience. Lily smiled, her eyes glistening. He'd spend hours showing her the perfect technique, even when he was getting tired. That was Michael, always giving everything he had. James watched as Emma successfully skipped a stone across the water's surface. He would have loved seeing how she finally mastered it. "Daddy, Mommy," Thomas called out, running toward them with his small hands cupped together. "Look what we found." The children settled onto the blanket, Emma proudly displaying her collection of smooth lake stones while Thomas carefully opened his hands to reveal a perfectly heart-shaped pebble. "Why are there ribbons on the big tree, Daddy?" Emma asked, her head tilting curiously. James pulled her close. "Those ribbons are like little pieces of love, sweetheart. Each one represents someone special and the memories we share with them. Like Uncle Michael. He loved that tree." "Did Uncle Michael skip stones too?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "He was the best at it," Lily answered, ruffling his hair. "He's the one who started our tradition of collecting special stones from the lake." The family walked along the shoreline together, each searching for the perfect pebble to add to their collection. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and lake water. James watched his family, Lily helping Thomas balance on a log, Emma carefully examining each stone she found, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Michael's influence was everywhere. In the lessons he'd taught them about love and forgiveness, in the simple traditions he'd started, and in the way he'd helped shape their family's heart. Looking out over the tranquil lake, James whispered, "Thank you, Michael." Lily's hand found his again as the first stars began twinkling above them, their light reflecting off the water's surface like scattered diamonds. If you enjoyed the story of the Jimmy, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.